Hello, hello.
Okay.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Angular Nation. I'm Bonnie. We're here in the Experts channel with Dmytro from Decoded Front End. Very excited to have my friend back with us. How are you doing, Dmytro?
Yeah, I'm fine. Thank you. Very, very excited to share some knowledge with you.
We're happy to have you. We've actually had a lot of people joining Angular Nation from your YouTube channel. And then hopefully we'll have people also knowing about your YouTube channel from Angular Nation and do some cross promotion because that's actually why I think I became friends with you in the first place, wasn't it? I reached out to you and was like, hey, your YouTube channel is really cool. And
Yeah, it
then
was
you were
quite
like, hey, you're cool. Okay. And we've been friends ever since.
exactly. Yeah, and it was 1 year ago or something like that, if I
I feel like
remember
I've known you
right.
forever.
Yeah, the same.
So I came to bug you because you're just doing so much cool stuff. And I said, come and teach us cool stuff. And so you're going to teach us about forms tonight?
Yeah, my pleasure. So I can proceed, right?
Absolutely.
All right, so let me share the screen. Here we go.
Do-do-do.
All right. Can you confirm that you
Yes.
see this nice intro? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Stop. Ignore. Okay. Yeah. Today I would like to share with you some stuff that I discovered not so long time ago. Actually, it happened when I was consulting one small team. And they asked me to have some training about forms because they were a team of beginners in Angular, and their project was basically like the model of the project was very huge form. A very huge form with custom form controls with different steps and so on. And they asked me to share some knowledge in that. And when I started to prepare some information for them, I thought like I use these forms quite a long time, so it's not a problem. But when you start to share your knowledge, you start to dive also deeper in how stuff are working. That's usually what happens to me. And when I was working on that, I ask myself, like, what happens when we actually import just a module? Yeah, we import, and I thought that some of people there might ask, and like, what is happening? And I should have the answer for this question. And why I asked myself this question, because during the preparation, I noticed one interesting stuff. When I have just a form, just simple HTML5 form without any Angular stuff imported, I mean, forms related stuff imported. When we submit the button, it is being reloaded. Yeah, you can see that I click save button and the page is being reloaded, which is fine. It's a default behavior of the form. And then I did import the forms module into my component. It was just a use case. And yeah, once I did it, I noticed a very interesting thing. And oops, sorry. Yeah, it's just a very slow slide. So I imported just model. I didn't add anything. I didn't add any ng form directive, anything. So just a forms model. I added it to the component, and then I saved these changes, and I went to the browser, and for whatever reason, I decided to submit the form. And when I submitted, I noticed that the form is not being reloaded anymore. I mean, the page is not being reloaded anymore. So the default behavior was prevented by something. And I was like very curious, like, okay, I didn't do anything. I just imported this model. What happened at this moment? And for me, it was basically kind of magic. Yeah. So I started to, I don't believe in magic. So I started to, trying to figure out how stuff are working. And then what I have done, I started to investigate. I decided that, okay, I have to check what kind of maybe some directives reside on my form. And I just used the get directives utility that is available for you when you run Angular application in development mode. And I saw this picture. So it turns out they were automatically somehow applied directives, like 3 directives, which I didn't add them. So how they appeared. And then to my mind came that idea that, or not idea, but like I realized that, very often we think about directives like selector for the directive should be some attribute. But in fact, the selector for the directive can be like also tag name. It can be the class name. So when we do that, the directives are kind of applied automatically. And turned out when I started to, I wanted to check this theory, I dived into the source code, and it was actually the case we saw. And then I started, okay, we have 3 directives. Let's try to figure out what those directives are responsible for. And let's have a look at them, what they are doing actually. So the first one is ngForm. And this directive does actually a lot of stuff, but the core functionality, the core responsibility of that is to register controls within the form into the form group that represents this form. So like the core functionality is like that. Then there is a ngNoValidate directive that is very simple one. It disables the native behavior or native validation for the form, because forms can have their native browser validation. Actually, you can create just a regular form, add some input. This input can have required property, and for browser, it's kind of validator. It will be checking that and perform the native validation. We usually don't need it in Angular because we have our own implementation of validations and stuff. So by default, Angular forms disable the native browser validation. And this is the source code of this directive. It is like the full code actually. So, I mean, it does the only one thing. It adds the noValidate attribute to the element where it was applied. You can see it like in the host property, this noValidate property. And there is a third directive. It's quite a big selector, but this directive, it is responsible for the tracking the form control group status. Which statuses it might be. You probably saw them if you worked with forms. The state can be touched, untouched. The form can be valid or invalid, and the form can be also submitted, right? So those statuses are being tracked by this third directive. So yeah, this is what is about the form itself. Those three guys, they're residing on the same node and they like perform some stuff. Additionally, the ng form does another things. Oh, sorry, I missed the slide. Yeah, here I just wanted to highlight that pay attention on the selectors. That all of them, they have selector form that doesn't have ng form attribute, which makes the form tag as a valid selector for those directives. So that's why those directives immediately were applied to our form without adding them explicitly in our Angular templates. And the following conclusion that we can do from this from this selector is that if you, for whatever reason, want to make some form, so to say, invisible for Angular, you can add ng form attribute to the form, and Angular will ignore this form. It will not apply this directive, so native browser validation will be enabled for the form, and like statuses for the form also will not be applied. Yeah, and then additionally, ng form directive does a couple of interesting things. It handles some native form events like submit and reset. And there you can see the handlers that are involved to the corresponding event. So when we do on submit, when we submit the form, the on submit handler is involved, and it does pretty simple stuff. It sets the submitted property to true, and this property will be used then by this directive that is tracking the status to apply the ng submitted CSS class. We will have a look at this a bit later. Then happens the synchronization of the controls, of the pending controls in the form, and then it emits the ng submit event. So ng submit in this case, it's just a regular Angular output event emitter. Yeah, it just emits value that you can then listen in your template and somehow react on that. And then it returns false. And by returning false, we prevent the default behavior of the form. So that's why exactly this return false caused the situation when our page, when our form submission doesn't reload the page, because we prevent the default behavior. So this is what happens, and that's why the reason why we saw the behavior as we saw before, that the page is not being reloaded. And we also have the reset form. Reset form is it does just resetting of the form controls to the null if there is no value. If there is value, then it will be reset to the values are provided for the reset function. This is the method of form group instance. If you worked with reactive forms, you know them. Form group has this method, and when you call this method, every form control within this group, if it was dirty, it becomes pristine. If it was touched, it becomes untouched, and as I said, the value becomes either null or the value you provided. And of course, it submitted property reset and gets the false value, so the form loses ng submitted status in this case. So this is what ng form does under the hood, and does it automatically once we import the forms module into our application. But besides form, we have also controls, right? Because the form without controls, like, a bit useless. And I started also to investigate ng models, and like similar thing again happens for reactive forms as well. But I think template-driven forms in this use case, it's easier to grasp. But yeah, so there is ng model directive also. We apply it. And what happens then? So I tried to investigate one of my controls as well, the same way I did for the form. And yeah, I just pick any control in my form, and using the same get directives helper method, we see that the ng model is not alone. It turns out that it resides on the node with another two directives, ng control status and default value accessor. Interesting. So let's have a look closer on each of these pieces like we did for the form. So there's ng model. Of course, this is very simplified version, but one of the most like important stuff that does ng model, it creates the form control instance that represents some input, select, or whatever you use as a native control. And it registers it within the form. A bit later, we will see how and when it happens. But yeah, for ng model, those are like two most important things. Then there is a ng control status. It does similar thing what ng control status group does. It tracks the status for every form control. If it's dirty, if it was touched, if it was if it's valid or invalid, things like that. And the third one is, oops, early, no spoilers. Okay, the third one is control value accessor. Value accessor, it's very important building block that especially important when you try to create custom control that is different from native, like inputs, select, and others. What it actually does, so we have the native control, some input, right? We have its representation as a class, as a model. And this is form control, and this is form group. Those models, they describe the native controls. And Angular doesn't like work directly, it doesn't update values directly there. And Angular uses value accessor for that. So value accessor, it is a bridge or some abstraction that sits between native control and the model. And it is responsible for the synchronization between the model and the native control. For instance, we know that the value for the control can be changed from two sides. From the user side, so user types something in the input. So once the value changes there in the native control, this value should be synchronized with its model, with the form control, and vice versa. We can use method set value for the form control instance, and this value should be reflected on the, I call it view side, yeah, the side where native control exists. And value accessor is responsible for this communication. It knows how to how to work with them, how to synchronize those stuff. There are like different value accessors, and you can implement your own one, as I said, if you need implement some custom control. And in order to make it work, the accessor should have some set of methods that are required for the proper communication between the model and between the native control. Those are write value, register on change, register on touched function methods, and set disable state, which is optional. All those, like for instance, default value accessor that implements this control value accessor interface, it has the implementation, the concrete implementation of how the value should be updated. So this default value accessor works with inputs, with the native browser inputs, right? And here you can see the implementation. So in order to update on the view side for the input, the value, so if we have in the model, for instance, the value as a string text, in order to make it visible on the view side, we have to set the attribute value to the test on the input, on the control, right? In order to see it in the browser, this value. And this is exactly what does the default value accessor. It just uses renderer. If you don't know renderer, it's a special service that is used to add different attributes to the node element or add different classes. So if you need to modify, if you need to work with some node element, you use renderer. And here happens basically this thing. Register on change, this is the method. So I forgot to say that write value is a method that is called when the value changes on the model side. So when we have a model, some form control instance, we call set value method there. Then the control value accessor called write value, and there already some like value accessor already updates the value on the view side. But also can happen that user changes some value in the input, and then we have to do other way around. We have to update the model. And then there will be used the function that register on change method provides. You can see as an argument, there is a function. And this function needs to be called to propagate this value from the view side, from the user input to the model. So this is how they communicate. And the same for register on touched. Register on touch responsible for like updating the status if the control touched or untouched, means that if user already interacted with this input or not. So now, like what happens during the initialization of the forms? So we have the ng form, right? And what happens at the constructor time when the ng form is initialized? It immediately creates the form group instance. And yeah, by the way, probably I had to start from it like at the very beginning. Template-driven forms, they build on top of reactive forms, actually. So
what?
Under the hood, template-driven forms, they use reactive forms. They use these for building blocks that we use for the reactive ones, like form group, form control. But just the difference is that who is the owner of them? In reactive forms, our components are owners of form control, form group, and we work with them. In template-driven forms, form group and form control, the owner is the directive, ng form, and respectively the ng model. And I mean, who is experienced, they most probably noticed that like it is like that, but beginners think that it's completely different something. Yeah, template-driven forms, they are completely different. But actually, no, they are like using reactive forms under the hood, basically. Yeah, and here you can see this example. ngForm directive creates the form group and it owns it. Not our component, but the ngForm directive, the owner of the form group directive. It happens during the build time. Then happens initialization of ngModel. And ngModel, when it does initialization, it injects first the ngForm, the parent. It injects via dependency injection, and it injects the value accessor. It also injects some other stuff, but for simplicity, I just drop it so far. So yeah, having that, ngModel can register the form control that it creates during the build time as well. So something similar to what ngForm does. When ngModel is being initialized, it creates the form control instance. So what you do when you use reactive forms, you do it in your component, you create form control, right? And then bind it with the control using form control name directive. Here, like the directive itself creates the form control instance and it owns this instance. When directive dies or destroyed, then form control also will be destroyed. Yeah. So having the parent form injected, and when form control is created, then ngModel does registration of the form control that is created into the in the parent form, right? So it happens inside the ng on changes lifecycle hook. That first time is invoked between the constructor time and ng on init, and like it happens immediately after the constructor time. So it has the reference for the form directive. It calls add control and passes itself as an argument for this add control method. And there happens the actual registration. Container here is that's yeah, so source code, maybe a bit noisy, but you can see on the line 2 there is a container. The container, it's the form group that is created by ngForm actually, right? And form group has a property like register control. Register control allows you to add the control to this group. Yeah, I think the name is really self-explanatory. And it registers the control from the directive there and uses the directive name as a key for it. That's why you have to always provide the name for the input when you use ngModel, because this name attribute in the input will be used as a key for inside the form group of ngForm group. Yeah. So then happens the most interesting thing to me, at least, setting up of the control. And you can see that appropriate setup control function is being called, where provided the control and the directive itself. Directive in our case will be ngModel. And yeah, we moving to the next slide. This is how looks the setup control function. Yeah, there happens setup validators, things like that, but also it is a place where models and form control or form group meets the value accessor, where happens this breaching, I don't know how to explain it, where happens the communications between them. And on the line 2 or 3, depends how to count, you can see this dir.value accessor write value. Here happens the first kind of synchronization of values from the model with the native control. Yeah, we call the right value. That, if you remember, this is the piece of the code that knows how to update the value on the native control side. In this case, it just sets the value property to the value that is provided. So this is happens the first synchronization between them. Then I dropped the disable because there happens pretty much similar stuff. What is also interesting is the setup view change pipeline function. This function setup, you can see that it calls the register on change method for the value accessor. And as an argument, it provides the function that eventually is called by our control value accessor, by our implementation, to let our model know when the value on the native control side is changed. This is if you have ever implemented the custom control value accessor, you know that you have in the register on change method, you take some function, you assign this to the property usually called on change, and then you just call it. You don't know what is inside, what this function is. And now you know. This is just a function that does a closure, the closure function that captures the control. And when the function is called with the new value, it updates the value that currently the pending value, and updates also like pending dirty. So because when value changes for the control, it becomes dirty. And then depending on the strategy, how you update your form control, it updates the control either immediately if the update on strategy change, which is default one. So means that every time the user types some value into the input, then the model has to be also updated. But you can have different strategies. It can be change, it can be blur, and it can be submit. So when blur, the update of the model happens only when the blur events for the control happens. Or if submit, then the value of the model will be updated only when you submit the form. And that's why we need this pending. Yeah, because pending is like temporary value of the control before it will be kind of fixed. So you can think about this update control function that you can see as a git commit function. Yeah, you can change a lot of things in your code, but when you are ready, you do commit and you fix your changes. So update control does kind of the same thing. Because if you have strategy on submit, for instance, you can change a lot of values, a lot of time the value for your control, but it should not be like reflected. Yeah, only when some event happens, like submit, only then you commit the changes and update the model. So now you know what is going on when you call this on change function, when you implement your custom control value accessor. And something similar happens for the blur pipeline. It is also the callback function, but it is responsible for updating touch and untouched status for the form form control or form group, whatever. So this is how it looks like. And the rest, the setup model change pipeline, for instance, it's very similar to setup view change pipeline, the first one, but it's responsible for other way around. So it is involved when model changes and you have to update it on the view side. And the first option does responsible for another direction. But they work, like the idea is the same, so that's why I didn't include them all there, because it would be too much noise. And yeah, and the last thing, how communicates the ng model and ng control status, how ng control status directive tracks the statuses for the control. So actually the statuses, they are okay, it's better to start from another side. So we have ng control status directive and ng model, they reside on the same node. Then ng control status injects the ng model by a dependency injection. And after that, basically the ng control status directive has everything it has to know in order to apply appropriate statuses to the control, or status classes to the control. You know, you probably saw this CSS classes in your inputs, like ng valid, ng touched, ng untouched, and things like that. So because ng model is owner of the form control, when we inject it, it can read already then the status from the form control instance, like here. So we read that it's valid, and if it is valid, so when getter returns the true, then we just attach an appropriate class. This is what you can see right now, this class dot ng valid and ng invalid. This is similar, like host binding decorator. Like it's just another notation. It's an old one, and to be honest, I don't know why Angular team uses until now this notation. I don't know, maybe historical reasons or some other reasons. I don't know, but it is the same as to use host binding decorator. So this is basically it, how they are like communicating to each other. So I believe there's the last slide that should say thank you to you for your attention. And yeah, maybe if you have any questions or discussion, we can start right now, because I know that it's a big topic that has to be somehow placed in the small presentation, so probably have a lot of questions, but yeah, I would be happy to answer, at least to try.
I'm glad that all of that was recorded, because we get questions a lot about forms on Angular Nation. And now we can say, watch this video, and you will probably find the answer somewhere in there.
Yeah. Actually, I'm preparing the whole course about this stuff, with diving into this source code stuff. And yeah, there it's a bit more interesting and a bit more clear, because I try to, it is hard to put it like everything on slides.
Yeah, but, it's a lot. Akila said she always thought that when you said the reactive forms were underneath, because she used the JSON pipe to debug forms, and then the object looks like reactive forms.
Sorry?
You said that it's all reactive forms under the hood.
Mm-hmm.
And it all, or basically that they have the same. I think people might argue with you on that it's the same under the hood. It is the same under the hood, but then there's like the shared methods, and then either reactive or template. But these were template driven, but most of the same would be true for reactive forms as well.
Yes. I mean that I didn't want to say that they are the same. I wanted to say that template-driven form, they kind of built on top of reactive forms. So they use reactive forms. It's just there were different ways how they communicate. For instance, how happens the update of the property on the class and the property name, property class and the form control value. So it happens asynchronously in template-driven forms and synchronously on the reactive forms. So different ways, but still the building blocks, like form control, form from groups, like they're used by template-driven forms as well. And this is what I wanted to say.
Yeah. I get you. Go ahead, Akila. You wanted to add something?
Oh yeah, I never thought that they were the same. It's just that when you look at the object, you just know it helped me realize what was going on with reactive forms, because the properties that come with the forms, it helped me learn reactive, looking at the object that comes with template driven forms. That's all I was saying. I didn't think they were the same, but it did seem similar enough to feel like they're trying to accomplish the same things, just differently. Like when you're doing template driven forms, you feel like you don't have to think as much, or it's not customized. It's like, this is what I'm giving you. And then when you use reactive forms, it feels like you're customizing what you would do with template driven forms. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you have more control. Well, or you have control in a different place, but it's like Angular handles more for you in one place, and then you do it all. And it's the same with the view control ref, or the view container ref, sorry. That you have different options of how you can handle it.
And also, I'm a really, 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 really big fan of yours. I think I have your Angular interviewing course, and I actually sent you a DM a year ago, and Instagram, Instagram, because I had a question on a project I was working on, but you never returned it. I was like, oh well. It looked like you didn't read it, though. It looked like you didn't really see it. So.
In Instagram?
Yes, Instagram. That's
Instagram, I use it quite rare. And I disabled their all notifications because it's distracting so much. So that's why I can missing messages in Instagram. I would, if you want to contact me, it's better to use Twitter, probably.
This is why I go get him and bring him here and say, let's have a Q&A. Hey, Dmytro, are you done? Can you, if you're done with your screen, will you turn your screen share off and we can do Q&A?
Yeah, sure.
Now is your chance. If you have questions now, Akila. And Ian has a question or a comment or a joke. Go ahead, Ian.
Hello, Dmytro. So I just have one question. Is that from your experience? So can you share with us in which scenario we should use template-driven form, and in which scenario we should use reactive form?
You got to join the great debate.
Yeah,
we're going to get into the nitty-gritty.
Very debatable question, actually. I know to me personally,
just from your point of view.
I know where if I have, for instance, standalone inputs, I would go with immediately with reactive form, because usually, like standalone form, I mean, imagine that you have some global search. Yeah, and when you type, I usually use some reactive approaches. So I want to apply some different operator, RxJS operators or whatever, and reactive forms give me such an opportunity immediately. I can subscribe to value changes property, and it creates.
I love the value changes.
Yeah, it gives you the stream, so I can already apply some set of operators and deal with that. Do some HTTP calls, for instance. In this case, I think reactive forms are good choice, because you could do something similar with template-driven forms, but then you would need to using view child decorator, include your ng model into your component, and then get access through this directive instance to the control and listen. It an unnecessary job for me. So I would go with the reactive forms. Also, if I need control over the types, if it's very important for me, if it's a big form, if it's a highly dynamic form, I would go with the reactive form, because like template-driven forms, they handle a lot of things on the view side, and for complex logic, it is hard to read, it is hard to maintain, and it's hard to scale. But if you have some form, I don't know, login screen where you have just email and password, or just, I don't know, simple form with 3-5 fields, like, why not go ahead with the template-driven forms?
I would agree with that.
I don't know.
But Sonder does not agree with that. So I think the same thing. I think, because I really like reactive forms, I like the value changes a lot, because I used to have to do stuff like that before Angular, and it was a lot more code. So it really just is so clean and simple to me. But Sonder has very strong feelings about, and I have argued with Sonder before about JavaScript in general, and I was very confident, and then I found out I was wrong. And it's a little painful to argue when you're wrong, but this is how we learn, right? So I haven't actually gotten into the discussion really with Sonder about why he loves it so much, but he really strongly prefers template-driven forms, because basically he says anything you can do in reactive forms, you can do in template-driven forms, which is true, but I like reactive forms. So we're going to have this debate. So Dmytro, maybe you and I should be on a team against, I don't want to be on a team against Sonder, but it's going to be a good discussion either way.
Yeah,
but Sonder does
it's...
say in some situations, like, it's not that it's awful, but he has very strong opinions.
I think in half of the cases, choice between template-driven forms and reactive forms, it's just matter of taste.
Yeah, yeah.
You can do a lot of things using both approaches. It's just how you feel comfortable. Like, if your team worked with template-driven forms before, and you are confident with that, go ahead, no problem. I mean,
well,
if
that's
it's not
just very
complex.
diplomatic. How are we going to have a great debate with logic like that? That's so logical and rational. Well, we'll see how logical and rational we are when Sonder gets here. He'll debate us for sure.
I mean,
but I agree with you. I think really they're both very useful.
It is matter of taste in most of the cases.
Yeah,
it's my opinion.
Yeah. Well, this conversation keeps coming up. And yes, it's a matter of taste, but this is the thing about the Angular community, right? That Angular is very opinionated, and we want to have the Angular way. And when I was learning, not just Angular, but programming in general, I got super confused when experts are like arguing and saying, oh, you need to do it this way. No, this is the best way. No, this is the best way. It totally scrambled. I was like, I don't even know what to do. So this is why when I got into architecture, that I would always try to, like, let's all get together and come to a consensus. And when we say, like we were talking about a couple years ago, I was talking about GraphQL and NGRX. Like, they're both good, but you wouldn't really use them together necessarily, maybe. But where would you use one and where would you use the other one? And like, where do you draw that line? And so when we come to template-driven forms versus reactive forms, because I do agree with you, Dmytro, that they're both good. They both have their uses, and I would probably use template-driven forms for something simpler, and I'll use reactive forms for something that's more dynamic. But I do think that we should get into the conversation, have the debate, so that we can all be on the same page. Because yeah, like Aristides said, it's confusing. Which one do we use for what? Yeah. So we're going to discuss.
For me, I would say 60% for reactive forms, 40 for template-driven forms. So I would choose, by default, I would choose probably reactive forms by default.
We should, I wish there was like a way, we should probably find a way to like make it into like a battle in a game and like have a winner at the end, but I don't know how we would do that. Anyway, okay, Akila, go ahead.
This might be it's a beginnerish question, but is it based on any type of design patterns or paradigm specifically of the way that you would choose which form you would want to use? Like, does that question make sense?
I think so.
Like is there a specific, because I'm learning that when you have a certain taste for certain ways you like to program, it's really like a pattern that people see, or maybe they see that something is cleaner. Other than template-driven forms are good for something more simpler. If I have seen people use it for something more complicated, do you think it's based on like certain design patterns that makes it, that helps you choose which ones you would rather use versus the other?
Well, this is where we're going into the great debate, because a lot of us kind of agree, but then we go, and Sonder, right? And Sonder has been around for a while, and he knows what he's talking about. And we all have a lot of respect for Sonder, and Sonder he loves the template-driven forms, and so if we don't all have the same opinion, especially among the GDEs, right, then we should all get together and get on the same page. So that's going to be the great debate, the template-driven forms. We have people joining for the Friday social. We're talking about so we had a conversation. Actually, we should wrap up. We should stop the recording for for Dmytro.
Oh, yeah, by the way,
because we're transitioning into the Friday social. Before we turn off the recording, can everybody just, the routine, help me thank Dmytro for his time. And Dmytro, hopefully you'll stay for the Friday social.
Yeah, I stay a little bit. I have to go in 15 minutes or so, but yeah.
Okay. Everybody, will you come off mute and help me thank Dmytro, Decoded Front End, for coming by?
Thank you.
Thank you, Dmytro.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dmytro.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dmytro.